Turning it over to our next speaker, who is Olivia Stillman, and she'll be presenting her thesis on the need for trauma-informed frameworks for urban environmental work, a comparative case study of environmental organizations in Detroit. And so her slides look like they're up. Her thesis advisor is Jeremy Levine in organizational studies, and her reader is Katie Richards Schuster in the School for Social Work. So turn it over to Olivia.
Hi, can everyone hear me? Okay, cool. I think that is a yes. So thank you for the introduction. My thesis is titled The Need for Trauma-Informed Practices in Urban Environmental Work, a comparative case study of environmental organizations in Detroit. Really quickly, before I get started, I just wanted to give some background on why I chose to research this topic in the first place. Outside of my academic studies at Michigan, I've spent a lot of time working with environmental organizations in Detroit, and these experiences have been just like really impactful, and I've learned a lot from them, and it really opened my eyes to how much of an impact environmental organizations can have on communities. Aside from providing environmental benefits, there are so many social and economic benefits that environmental organizations can provide, and I thought that was really interesting and inspiring, so I wanted to look into the ways that environmental organizations interact with their target communities and kind of like look at that relationship. And I was also inspired by my work with Michigan Sexual Assault Prevention Awareness Center. The connection between these two things isn't completely obvious, but I really like the framework that SAPAC uses and other sexual assault organizations use to interact with survivors and volunteers, and that's a trauma-informed framework. So in this study, I'm just going to be looking at how we can apply trauma-informed framework to environmental organizations. So for the setup of my thesis, there are two main components. The first one is the background, and it's a really in-depth literature review, and it forms like a theoretical foundation for why organizations should adopt trauma-informed frameworks, and I cover topics such as like what is trauma, like what types of challenges can trauma impose on environmental organizations, and the basics of trauma-informed practices. I wrote this in a way that it would be helpful for and accessible for environmental organizations, so they could read it and kind of like understand the connection between the two. And then in addition to that component of my thesis, the second half, I conducted 5 case studies with environmental organizations across Detroit that all focus on different types of environmental work. And the purpose of this section is really to see how trauma impacts organizations like in the field and in the real world, and to see like what the actual connection is between trauma and the work that environmental organizations are doing. Just to start, some basics on trauma. Trauma is a psychological response to a threatening event or series of events that can influence an individual's mental, physical, emotional, or spiritual well-being. Trauma is triggered by the onset of intense emotional sensations such as grief or fear, loss. And there are a lot of different types of like events that can cause or can be traumatic. And I've listed a few of them here in the second bullet, but this is not like an all-inclusive list. And additionally, not everybody who experiences these types of events are traumatized or really experience the impact of trauma. It's really dependent on someone's like social and physical context and environment. And because trauma is so different for everybody who experiences it, it's really easy to go untreated or undiagnosed. Not everyone who suffers from trauma knows that they're suffering from trauma, and it's not always obvious. So because of that, it's really important that organizations treat every single person that they interact with this understanding that it's possible that they could have experienced trauma at some point in their life. And I don't think people really realize how common trauma is in society. It's estimated that about like 61% of men and 51% of women in the United States experience at least one traumatic event in their lifetime. So it's really common, but I think it's also important to note that the incidence of trauma is not the same across the country. There are different groups that are disproportionately impacted by the effects of trauma. In particular, low-income African Americans residing in cities happen to be at a heightened risk for the exposure to trauma. And there are a lot of reasons for this, but exposure to violence and concentrated poverty, as well as racism, contribute to the increased risk of exposure. And this is really also problematic because in a lot of these settings, there's a decreased access to support and mental health care services. So I think that even in cities, it's even more important that organizations that are not providing like mental health services are attuned to the challenges of trauma and are trying to help with the healing of their participants. So understanding trauma allows an organization to think more critically about how their identity, approach, or position in a community may trigger participants. I think that this is really important. If we ignore the impact that trauma has on people, I think there's a lot of unintentional harm that can happen. And in Detroit, there are several specific sources of trauma that I think impact environmental work. And in my thesis, I go more in depth into these three things, but really briefly, I'll just kind of touch on what I'm talking about. For institutional betrayal and intergenerational trauma, in this section, we just think about the 1967 rebellion, police brutality, economic troubles, and most recently, Detroit's water shutoffs. All of these events over the past 50 or so years impact residents' perceptions of organizations and services that are meant to help them in a negative way, I would say. People are not so easy to trust organizations because of these events. Also, the second one, pain and loss of place. The destruction of like socially and culturally significant spaces like churches, community centers, neighborhoods can be really traumatic for people. And that's also a source of mistrust. And then finally, pollution and environmental trauma. Detroit is home to one of the most polluted zip codes in Michigan, 48217, and also the neighborhood surrounding Detroit's incinerator are both very heavily polluted neighborhoods, and exposure to environmental stressors is traumatic in itself, and also just increase the likelihood of different health consequences and untimely death. Those are both like traumatic in themselves. So why does trauma matter? A lot of the success of environmental organizations requires community support and engagement. So if people are preoccupied by the trauma in their life, it's harder for them to engage with organizations, especially if organizations aren't aware that the trauma exists. So when residents are bombarded with threats to their personal and community safety, the way that they view the world around them and the people around them is vastly different than before. So just for example, a few of the challenges that are associated with exposure to trauma include a loss of trust and social cohesion, loss of stability and reliability, consistency, and disempowerment and lack of community ownership. So when people's voices are consistently ignored or denied, people may develop a worldview where they don't feel like their goals are possible to achieve. And yeah, so if we fail to address these challenges, it also just amplifies the effect of trauma in communities. So I think that organizations should be aware of these challenges in order to overcome them and be successful in the work that they're doing. And to do this, I propose that environmental organizations should adopt trauma-informed frameworks. And a trauma-informed framework is a strengths-based service delivery approach that is grounded in an understanding of responsiveness to the impact of trauma, that emphasizes physical, psychological, and emotional safety for both providers and survivors, and that creates opportunities for survivors to rebuild a sense of control and empowerment. So trauma-informed frameworks, it doesn't mean that organizations have to shift what their goals of the organization is. Everything pretty much stays the same, but it's more of like a cultural shift and a shift in the way that things are done. All of the operations of an organization should reflect the values of trauma-informed frameworks. So things like safety, trustworthiness, collaboration, acceptance, empowerment, those all inform an organization's practices. And just a little bit more in depth on trauma-informed frameworks. There are 4 like main components of them. So the first is to realize that trauma can significantly impact a person's life and their pathways to recovery. The second is recognize that trauma may cause symptoms and challenges. And then, respond to target populations by implementing knowledge policies and procedures that are conscientious of the presence of trauma and resist re-traumatization. So the next section of my thesis is the case studies, and the goal of the case studies is, like I said, to gain an understanding of what organizations already know, to see how they're actually utilizing some of the values and practices of trauma-informed frameworks already, and just get a better understanding of what's actually happening in Detroit. And so I interviewed 5 different environmental organizations in Detroit. They all focus on different types of environmental work. The first is Youth Energy Squad, and they are a branch of EcoWorks and focus on youth programming and education. They also do a little bit of job training with high school students over the summer. Zero Waste Detroit is a recycling coalition, and they focus mainly on community engagement and advocacy. A lot of what they do is signing residents up for the curbside recycling service in Detroit. We Want Green Too is really a neat organization, and they focus on sustainable job training for veterans. Voices for Earth Justice focuses on urban gardening, and Great Lakes Pioneers, Detroit Pioneers is a coalition building organization and continuing education. Let me just move this. So after interviewing the organizations, I found that none of them formally have trauma-informed frameworks, which I was kind of expecting, but I was pleasantly surprised because all of the organizations were like aware of trauma and were able to like talk about it, and were kind of familiar with trauma-informed frameworks. The organizations also all mentioned that they have experienced challenges of trauma, and the most common ones that were experienced were loss of trust and social cohesion, the loss of stability and reliability, and consistency, and the breadth and depth of needs. Also, even though none of the organizations had formal trauma-informed frameworks, they all did have they all utilized practices that were consistent with trauma-informed frameworks. And here I just have a list of some of the ones that were the most common across the organizations. So this kind of gives like me hope that there is a really strong foundation to implement trauma-informed frameworks for these organizations in Detroit. And then finally, when comparing across the organizations, one second. The organizations that work with sensitive or vulnerable groups were more trauma-informed than organizations that work with broader populations. This is probably because there's just a lot more knowledge on sensitive groups like veterans and kids. It's like a very large area of study. And an organization's leadership, identity, structure, and age didn't seem to influence an organization's trauma knowledge, which I thought was really interesting, because I thought that maybe like if the leader of an organization was from the city, or if the organization was a certain type or structure of organization, it would make a difference, but it really didn't. But it's a pretty small case study, so or a small sample, so there's definitely room to do more research. And then finally, just to conclude, just a few recommendations. Develop trauma-informed frameworks for environmental organizations. This just requires additional research, increase the availability and quality of training, and standardize and stress the need for feedback. And I just want to end by saying, I think, unfortunately, this research is very timely. With COVID-19, a lot of people, I mean, it's a very like traumatic event in itself. And I think that not just environmental organizations, but all organizations and businesses need to really think about the way that they interact with people and treat people with kindness moving forward. So that's all I have.
Great, excellent. Thank you so much. We have time for a few questions. So I'll start with one as other folks are thinking about some things or potentially entering into chat. Just as you're thinking about your work, I think everything that you're talking about is incredibly valuable. I guess in some ways it's this question of why wouldn't all organizations take into account a trauma-informed framework? In the sense that it seems like many of the practices that you're highlighting are really good community engagement practices that obviously have to be even more taken into account into sensitive and vulnerable populations. But in many ways, it just seems like really strong community engagement skills. And so obviously it's really important for these populations, but why wouldn't this just be broadly considered best practices overall?
Yeah, like I said, I just think that I think this is still a relatively new area of study. So I think a lot of people are just starting to realize how widespread trauma is. But I think, yeah, there just needs to be more like knowledge and training available for organizations. I think a lot of people already are on the right track. Like the organizations that I talk to all are doing things that are trauma informed, but they just don't necessarily know, like they don't have all the connections to it. So I think, yeah, a lot of people are on the right track and just need a little bit more guidance specifically about like trauma and knowledge on that.
So Olivia, I kind of want to ask you almost an implementation question, I think, which kind of gets at, you talked a little bit about how adopting this kind of trauma-informed framework might change, might affect like organizational culture or have them kind of focus on safety in different ways. But I'm wondering if you also have thoughts just about like how they go about delivering their programming, like the kinds of opportunities that they actually give people in these communities. And specifically, I'm kind of interested in your thoughts about like opportunities to help people feel more empowered as a way to maybe kind of address some of these underlying issues. And I don't know if you have more you can kind of say about that.
Yeah, I definitely, I think, address that a little bit more like in my written thesis. I think a lot of it is like in the collaboration piece. And one of the, I don't think I mentioned it, but one of the values of trauma-informed frameworks is empowerment. So it's built into the way that organizations, if they do adopt a trauma-informed framework, it's built in the way that they should operate by providing opportunities for people to feel like their voices are being heard and that they are playing an integral role in what is happening. So I think that's really neat that it's just like a really like set part of the framework in itself.
I was muted. Thank you so much, Olivia, for an excellent presentation and great work. So we virtually applaud you and very well, nicely done.